Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of Dr. Phil Reads to Write. Today I would like to look at some work by the 20th century American poet A.R.Ammons. Before beginning his career as a poet and creative writing professor, Ammons was an industrial chemist, and you can really hear some of that scientific method and way of looking at the world in his poetry. Ammons was not a confessional poet at all. He gives few glimpses into his inner or interior psychology, but in the way that he develops his poetics of place, he still, like Sylvia Plath, is very interested in doing much more than just describing location or geography. As he moves or walks through a place, he likes to spend time with all of those interior thoughts, those digressions, the way that we are not only rambling with our feet through location or place, but our mind is also alert to maybe the sounds of what we can hear, of the different things we can see, but also free association and the way that as we move through place, thoughts around science, natural history, maybe human history, have also echoes and resonances inside our mind. So in his Poetics of Place, just like Sylvia Plath in our last episode, Ammons is really interested in holding in tension stresses, juxtapositions, and incredible metaphorical language. In this particular book that I have, a collection of essays and articles featuring the work of Ammons, Ammons wrote for this one small essay where he talked about the poem as being like a walk. And for him, the act of writing a poetry was very similar, or the act of writing a poem, was very similar to the act of going for a walk. And what he meant by that, I think, was this very thing that we were just talking about. This way of holding by free association different thoughts, musings, ramblings inside your head all at once. And so as we go for a walk, we are not only alert to sound, to visual stimulus, maybe to ideas from natural history and from cultural history, but we're also interested in the inner workings of how things work together as an ecosystem. We might be interested in all sorts of other ways of experiencing that particular place, whether it's to do with spirituality or science. And Ammons in this essay, it's a beautiful little essay, a beautiful way of looking at a poem, because one of the things I love to do when I'm writing is to go for a long walk. And of course that has pedigree all the way back to Wordsworth, doesn't it? Wordsworth wrote most of his poetry in terms of in his head while out walking, whether it was out along Dover Beach or in France on the beaches there. He wrote a lot of his sonnets striding up and down with Dorothy, his sister. And I love that way of looking at a poem as being similar to going for a walk. So that's just one thing. I have another book here, another book of essays on A.R.Ammons, which has a beautiful title, Considering the Radiance. I just love that, and it's a really good way of approaching the work of Ammons. Ammons really is a poet of light and of the sun, of daylight, of moving under the beautiful rays of the sun. So this book, Considering the Radiance, it is a great title, and Ammons' work, I think, does bear a lot of light onto the world. It is a beautiful way of looking at things. And there's a couple of interesting essays in this book. One of them is by Harold Bloom, and maybe with echoes, with resonance back to that sort of romantic nonsense of the individual creative genius. Bloom really looks at Ammons as possibly the greatest of all the 20th century American poets. And one of the reasons for Bloom that Ammons is such a great poet is because of the distinctive, the individuality of his voice. And for Bloom, like for some of the romantics perhaps, a voice can only be great if it is completely one-off. individual, authentic. And I have a feeling that this is possibly a bit of romantic nonsense. I love the way that a lot of contemporary poetry riffs off the whole writing culture that it exists within. And I love that. It's to read another poet is an act of generosity, and to engage with other poetry, to echo, riff off other poetry when you write your own work. It is a generous act. It's a sharing act, and I like that way of expression. But for Bloom, Ammons is a great voice because he is so independent, utterly unique. And of course it is interesting that Ammons lived in that late 20th century when so many poets were influenced by either objectivism with William Carlos Williams or Lorene Nidecker, with those sorts of people. And of course there were the great San Francisco Renaissance and the beat poets, and then there were all the language poets of New York, and of course confessional poetry, which is my cup of tea. I just love the confessional poets. And Ammons, it is true, probably didn't echo many of those resonances, that culture that he actually did live within in his poetry. Ammons probably was more influenced by a nascent echo poetry, and in developing his poetics of place, there really is a lot of that scientific method and of sense of doing justice, doing honour to the place, to the ecosystems that he is living in and walking through in his poetry. So I guess he could be seen as a type of proto-eco-poet. There's another essay in this book. I'm going back to Harold Bloom first. Bloom, as I said, sees Ammons as completely distinctive and utterly unique. And working through some of the cadences of Pound, Bloom traces Ammons all the way back to the American Transcendental Movement, particularly Thoreau, Emerson and Whitman. And he really sees, other than those influences, he really does see Ammons as being completely distinctive in his voice and authentic. And for Bloom, that is why Ammons is such a great poet. I have, I think, a slightly different way of looking at what we should consider to be great. I think it's probably overblown to see greatness only as being a one-off, an individual, authentic talent. I much prefer my poetry to be a riff off the literary culture that I exist within, and to be having a communication, a relationship with all of those poets that have come before me and whose company I now share through the works of their books. There's another terrific essay in this book, actually, which really goes back to Ammons' lecture about the poem as being like a walk. There's a wonderful piece in here by John Ashbery, and John Ashbery really does look at that side of Ammons' work. He really loves to look at Ammons as being a poet that doesn't provide answers, that doesn't necessarily arrive at a synthesis, that really can hold in tension even confusions, even contradictions. And, for John Ashbery, poetry, and the poetry that he really loves in Ammons in particular, is able to arrive at this really nuanced way of being in the world, of not trying to arrive at easy answers, and allowing contradiction, confusion, anxiety even, to live peacefully in the poem. So the John Ashbery piece in this book is also lovely, and it really has lovely echoes back to that beautiful poem, or back to that beautiful essay in here by Ammons himself, where he talks about or compares the poem as being like a walk. So, to the poetry. Possibly the most famous, probably the poem that Ammons is now most remembered for, is Corson's Inlet. And it is a poem that I love. I will never forget the first time that I came across this poem. It really changed for me what I thought a poem could be. And in particular, it changed for me how I thought the poem could live on the page. Because Ammons really came up with this beautiful way of scattering his lines across the page. And he was no longer caught in cement on that left-hand edge of the page, where everything had to, every line had to start with a capital letter and be right up against that left edge in a nice, neat line running down the page. For Ammons, most of his lines do not start with uppercase letters at all. There is a real sense of enjambment and of moving through a poem. And for Ammons, that sense of movement, that sense of walking through geography is echoed in the layout of the poem on the page. And he has this beautiful scattering in his lines across the page. And I spend a lot of time in art galleries, and in particular, like most of us, I love sculpture, and I particularly love contemporary sculpture. You can go back to the Victorian, to the early 20th century stuff, can't you? Those incredible bronze busts of men, of famous men. And, some of them have a real heaviness that doesn't really lead much to the viewer's eye in the way we look at things today, anyway, perhaps. But some of them have, a beautiful likeness. There are beautiful sculptures in that tradition, aren't there? I think of Circe in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, that stunning movement, that sculpture of Circe in the very moment of turning men into swine. It's a beautiful sculpture of female power, and it's of course always been one of the most favourite pieces in the Art Gallery of New South Wales because of that. But as we move into the mid-20th century and late 20th century sculpture, of course we move into abstract expressionism and all these other ways of being in the world. And, moving through sculpture with someone like, Barbara Hepworth or Henry Moore or the great Alberto Giacometti, you really do have a different way of being able to create a sculpture, of way things should look in space. And that's what Ammons is, I think, trying to echo here in the layout of the lines on the page. Instead of having everything like a Victorian bronze, hard up, with uppercase lettering running straight down that left-hand edge, Ammons likes to loosen things up, to breathe air into the poem, to have lots of space on the page, lots of white space. And he scatters those lines, and he has very irregular line lengths as well. So he really does give this sense of being, of breathing air into a poem. And the appearance of the poem on the page, to my eye at least, is very sculptural. And I just love that again in Ammons, and it's had a huge impact on much of my work, particularly in my two previous books, or my two current books, Cactus and Fume. So here is one of my favourite poems. You're going to hear this a lot from me. I have lots of favourites, but this is certainly another favourite. I probably prefer Sylvia Plath's Wuthering Heights, the Great Carbuncle, Hardcastle Crags. I love the way Plath, in developing her own very distinctive poetics of place, uses her exploration of geography, in terms of the pathetic fallacy, as a way of exploring interior, fraught psychology. Ammons doesn't do that, and I'm a fan of the confessional poet. But what he does do in this poem is, in describing geography, in moving and rambling through geography, in this instance, Corson's Inlet, he has this incredible way, by free association, of looking at what's going on around him, of listening, of seeing, and of allowing that to echo into all sorts of ruminations about language, about mind, about the way consciousness works, and about the way we, in a sense, embody consciousness in language. And he's really interested in looking at the limits of language and the way all of this is in flux. And this is a beautiful poem about change. But as much as it's a poem about Corson's Inlet and describing the walk through this inlet, it's a beautiful poem working through such things of change, of flux, and, as I said, of consciousness, mind, and speech or language. So here is Corson's Inlet by A.R.Ammons. I went for a walk over the dunes again this morning to the sea, then turned right along the surf, rounded a naked headland, and returned along the inlet to the shore. It was muggy, sunny, the wind from the sea steady and high, crisp in the running sand, some breakthroughs of sun, but after a bit, continuous overcast. The walk liberating, I was released from forms, from the perpendiculars, straight lines, blocks, boxes, binds of thought, into the hues, shadings, rises, flowering bends and blends of sight. I allow myself eddies of meaning, yield to a direction of significance, running like a stream through the geography of my work. You can find in my sayings swerves of action, like the inlet's cutting edge. There are dunes of motion, organisations of grass, white, sandy paths of remembrance in the overall wandering of the mirroring mind. But overall is beyond me, is the sum of these events I cannot draw, the ledger I cannot keep, the accounting beyond the account. In nature there are few sharp lines, there are areas of primrose, more or less dispersed, disorderly orders of bayberry between the rows of dunes, irregular swamps of reeds, though not reeds alone, but grass, bayberry, yarrow, all predominantly reeds. I have reached no conclusions, have erected no boundaries, shutting out and shutting in, separating inside from outside. I have drawn no lines as manifold events of sand change the dune's shape. They will not shape the same shape tomorrow. So I am willing to go along, to accept the becoming. Thought, to stake off no beginnings or ends, establish no walls. By transitions, the land falls from grassy dunes to creek, to under creek, but there are no lines, though change in that transition is clear as any sharpness, but sharpness spread out, allowed to occur over a wider range than mental lines can keep. The moon was full last night. Today, low tide was low. Black shoals of mussels exposed to the risk of air and earlier of sun. Waved in and out with the waterline inexact, caught always in the event of change. A young mottled gull stood free on the shoals and ate to vomiting. Another gull, squawking possession, cracked a crab, picked out the entrails, swallowed the soft shell legs, a ruddy turnstone running in to snatch leftover bits. Risk is full, every living thing in siege. The demand is life, to keep life, the small. Oh, don't you hate it when your pages get stuck together? Risk is full, every living thing in siege. The demand is life, to keep life, the small white black-legged egret. How beautiful, quietly stalks and spears. The shallows, darts to straw, to stab. What? I couldn't see against the black mudflats, a frightened fiddler crab. The news to my left over the dunes and reeds and bayberry clamps was full. Thousands of trees, swallows, gathering for flight, an order held in constant change, a congregation rich with entropy, nevertheless separable, noticeable as one event, not chaos, preparations for flight from winter. Cheat, 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 wings rifling the green clumps, beaks at the bayberries, a perception full of wind, flight, curve, sound, the possibility of rule as the sum of rudderlessness, the field of action with moving incalculable centre. In the smaller view, order tight with shape, blue tiny flowers on a leafless weed, a carapace of crab, snail, shell, pulsations of order. In the bellies of minnows, orders swallowed, broken down, transferred through membranes to strengthen larger orders. But in the large view, no lines or changeless shapes, the working in and out, together and against, of millions of events, this so that I make no form formlessness. Orders as summaries, as outcomes of actions, override or in some way result, not predictably. Seeing me gain the top of a dune, the swallows could not flight. Some other fields of Bayberry could enter full, berryless, and there is serenity. No arranged terror, no forcing of image, plan or thought, no propaganda, no humbling of reality to precept. Terror pervades, but is not arranged. All possibilities of escape open, no route shut, except in the sudden loss of all routes. I see narrow orders, limitless tightness, but will not run to that vast, easy victory. Still around the looser, wider forces work. I will try to fasten into order, enlarging gasps of disorder, widening scope, but enjoying the freedom that scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. Isn't that last line miraculous? This is such an understated, beautiful way to bring a wide-ranging, rambling poem to a conclusion. The other thing I love about that poem, when you read it out loud, particularly, you really capture this, is the sonic resonances in the poem. It's easy sometimes, or it's very easy sometimes to forget with contemporary poetry, because it scanning your line down the page before you maybe begin reading, you're not drawn immediately, your eye is not drawn immediately to end line rhymes. And as I said, there's not always, the poem like this is very irregular in its line lengths, it's scattered across the page, and it can be very easy to assume that there is, in a sonic sense, there's not really that much going on. But when you read this poem, again, you're really drawn to the editing, to the wrestle that Ammons does with language to make it sound just right. And the use of alliteration in particular is quite astounding often, isn't it? You must have been very aware of that as I was reading the poem. And this poem has a wonderful sense of drama. And it's not really, a sense of that sort of drama is not something you would maybe expect from a poem that's actually quite philosophical in the way that it is ruminating on language and consciousness and the way that mind works, on the limits of mind and consciousness, and the way that what we think today is not going to be the same as what we think today. It's a wonderful, very unexpected, beautiful poem. And as I said, I'm not one that's really drawn to having to be an authentic individual voice, a one-off. I love that generous act of reading and of having what I write echo what I've come across in the works of other poets. And Ammons is one of those poets who, I maybe don't return to quite as often as I do to someone like Sylvia Plath or John Berryman or John Ashcroft or Anne Sexton, W.D. Snodgrass, Robert Lowell even, particularly some of the earlier stuff. I'm probably more drawn to the confessional poets. That's the thing that really excites me, I guess, in poetry. But Ammons, I will never forget the first time I came across this poetry. And he taught me so much, in particular about ways of scattering those lines across the page and to really have that really sculptural approach to what the line should look like on a page, to white space, to breathing air between words and lines. And I really love that in Ammons. And it's something, particularly in my earlier work, I tried often to do. One of the first times I tried to do that was in a poem called At Wentworth Falls. And this is a poem that really does riff off what we had here in Ammons. My mind is not quite as philosophical, as intellectual as Ammons, so my poem is a little less ambitious than Ammons's work. But I am, as I'm describing place and as I'm trying to ramble through this location, I am very interested, not so much in consciousness and mind, but certainly in letting my mind, through free association, riff off natural history and science, and the way we can bring a natural history and natural sciences to bear in interpreting what we are looking at, what we are hearing or smelling as we walk through a beautiful place. For those who aren't familiar, Wentworth Falls is a beautiful place at the top of the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, just west of Sydney. It's a place where I grew up and lived all of my early adult life, and it's a place I still return to all the time. It's a spectacular sandstone and sclerophyll country. It's a country that I've walked through often going on long overnight expeditions through, and it's a place that I'm always drawn back to. And I love looking at these places, attuned, if you like, by the natural sciences, by the science of ecology, and I love thinking about how things fit together. And a sandstone country like the Blue Mountains, which has such very ancient and very poor quality soils and gets often very little rain. So it's a tough place to make a living. And I love thinking, there's a scientist in Australia called Tim Flannery, and he came up with this wonderful way of exploring ecology and thinking about ecology and looking at the fact that it almost is counterintuitive, but the more poor the resources that animals and plants have to work within, usually the greater the distribution and the varieties of the life forms are. So in a place like the Blue Mountains, where it really is a tough place to make a living, the abundance of animals and insects and plants and all sorts of things is just incredible. Everywhere you look, there's lots of different species. And partly that is caused by the fact that it is, ironically, a really tough place to make a living. Another thing that's very common with the Blue Mountains is, of course, wildfire, bushfire. And, fire is both a good thing and a bad thing. If it's managed poorly, and if it's a really hot, extreme fire, it can do massive damage to flora and fauna. But if it's managed more carefully, like First Nations people, like the people of the Darug and Ginninderra nations, always managed it for millennia. And we have so much to learn from First Australians about how to manage ecology and how to do all of these things. But when managed well, like the First Australians did, fire itself is actually a very positive thing that actually brings life into these ecosystems, not only by releasing nutrients into those very ancient soils, but also by allowing seeds to germinate and to set off, and to allow openings in the canopy and all sorts of things. So there was one time when there was a fire burning in the upper mountains, and just as the fire was burning and threatening to maybe destroy quite a bit of property, there was a forecast change by the Bureau of Meteorology. And the forecast change was a good change. It was actually going to bring rain and hopefully quieten this fire down. And so I was able to go up to the Blue Mountains. There's a beautiful walk there, called the Charles Darwin Walk. When Charles Darwin was on his voyage around the Earth in the Beagle, way before he had his theory of evolution, he stopped in Sydney and he went on horseback, and he actually crossed the Blue Mountains on horseback and went right out west of the Blue Mountains around Lithgow. And one of the places he stopped at and really wrote appreciatively of in his diaries was what later became known as Wentworth Falls. And the walk that I'm following is called Darwin's Walk because it's now a commemorative walk of Charles Darwin. We think it's fairly close to the actual route he took from the little township of Wentworth Falls at the time out along a ridge to the actual waterfalls. It's a spectacular lookout where there are waterfalls and you can see all of this bush. And I was lucky on this particular day to be able to head out to this lookout to do Charles Darwin's Walk and to see the fire with one eye while knowing that the forecast change of rain was coming, and I could see the clouds building. And it was a very dramatic, spectacular moment, which I tried to echo in this poem. As well as in praise of Wentworth Falls and in praise of great ecological systems, this is also a poem that riffs off Ammons, and in particular it riffs off his beautiful poem that we've just looked at, Corson's Inlet. So my poem is At Wentworth Falls. I follow Darwin's walk again this evening to the falls. From the ridge-tops, open forest, contouring around the furrowed boughs of black ash and the smooth pale stands of peppermint and blue gum flaking over banksia, mountain devil and waratah, zigzagging down to the overcliff track where clumps of button grass and a holly-like grevillea blooms among the sedges of hanging swamps, soils like peat collecting along shales and sandstones, the sponged seepage zones of a fernery's rare collection, and along to the lookout at the falls. A bushfire haze still burnt over the escarpment's western rim, while drizzle swirled about the communication tower like a halo. The forecasted change heralded to an alert line of towns threaded along the railway and Great Western Highway, the length of the mountain's navigable central ridge, the shape of a wilderness's threatened destruction. And from the brink of the lookout's precipice, in Darwin's grand amphitheatrical depression, the drama unfolded. And from this podium I counted in the change, a smothering mist pouring over, even as the volumes of smoke swept across the track, a catalyst, like the secret stowed away on the Beagle, a pillar of cloud leading Darwin to his promised land, a sighting that laid bare our origins and opened eyes to change. So like Ammons, my poem does riff off that idea of change and the way our way of looking, experiencing the world can change as new great ideas in philosophy and science come. And it is, as much of a celebration of the place, the geographical place of Wentworth Falls, it is a celebration of the work of Charles Darwin, whose diaries and work, when he, that he's written stuff that he left behind after his little visit to Sydney and crossing the Blue Mountains, is beautiful, and it's stuff that I love reading. And like the Ammons, I hope you could hear there that, I was trying to really bring the poem into live with those sonic dimensions, and there is a lot of alliteration and a lot of riffing off the names of plants and the names of plants, and hopefully, there's a lot going on there that does reward future readings. This is my very first book of poetry, Sweetened in Coals, which is again another riff off bushfire and the role that fire plays in the Australian landscape. Another poem that I wrote in this particular book that again riffs off that idea of change and the idea of ecology and the place of wildfire in ecology in the Australian context is a poem called Promised Land. This is another poem that really is in communication, relationship with that work by A.R.Ammons. Promised Land, of course, is a reference again from the Bible when Moses was taken up Mount Nebo and he was allowed to look at the Promised Land that was about to be given to the so-called chosen ones. So my poem is riffing also off these Old Testament references to Moses and Mount Nebo and being given maybe the Promised Land. I'm using the word Promised Land, of course, very ironically, because this was the land of the Darug people, and they had looked after it and treasured it for millennia before Europeans came along. But one of the things Europeans came along and did, of course, was wood getting and all that sort of extraction purposes. And then later on in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the bushwalkers came along. And there was a wonderful bushwalking club in Sydney in the late 19th century called the Warrigals. And the Warrigals was a bushwalking club started up by the Hall brothers in the late 19th century, going through to the sort of early, middle 20th century. And one of the places they loved to walk was this very place. It's known now, this is in the lower Blue Mountains, so a long way from Wentworth Falls. This is right back down the lower mountains in Blaxland and Glenbrook. And there's an area there which is now referred to as the Erskine Gorge. It's also referred to as the Blue Labyrinth because of the blue haze that comes off that eucalyptus haze, and labyrinth because lots of people went missing there. the Blue Mountains are a very difficult place for bushwalkers. You get lots of ridges and valleys and sub-valleys, and everything becomes a maze. It's very difficult bushwalking. So the Warrigals, one of the things they did, of course, was to create the first mud maps so that other people were also free to go and explore this place and hopefully remember and commemorate the work of the Darug people. The Darug people who are, of course, still there looking after and having custodianship of this really important sacred place. So this is my poem in praise of all of those sorts of ideas, science and ecology and all sorts of things. My poem is called Promised Land. The Erskine and its tributaries have dissolved fault lines into a labyrinth of lifted and folded ridges. Recently burned, the glossy blackened trees are shooting green, the scrub returning, the grass trees fired into flower. Commanding ground, Nebo Point and Pisgah Rock stand like towering Lamusu, bell miners chiming at their feet. At Pisgah, past the Attic Cave, a navigable track bends down to Monkey Ropes Creek, the land of Gad, a gully sheltering stands of coachwood, turpentine, sassafras. Epiphytes sunbake in the catwalk canopy, and sundews cluster among lichens like miraculous wounds. Continuing down the Yabby line from Creek Junction to Creek Junction, the Erskine Gorge opens to a sandstone escarpment, its vast precipice consumed by the water of this promised land, taken by the Warrigals, landlopers who came after the timber getters and hauled packs and crafted mud maps intimately measured. Amidst the profusion of tracks and scats, the Warrigals lived from their packs, surveying their wilderness, a canvas yearning pitched over the Darug's stone hearth glow. And that is a poem that, as well as riffing off and in relationship, communication with Ammons, that really is a poem that I hope, with that final line, is a real honouring also of the Darug people and of the custodianship of the Darug people to this part of the lower Blue Mountains, just west of Sydney in New South Wales. So that's just a little bit of a taste from my first book. My poetry, as I've got older, has become increasingly more confessional in nature, and that's probably what I'm most now known for. So my recent books, Fume and Cactus, are very confessional in their quality, and the book that I'm currently writing is an autobiographical verse novel to be called Hounded, and it is also very informed by that confessional poetic, that compulsion in the truth of the confessional eye to jolt and to maybe not in a melodramatic way, but to maybe shock the reader with what is actually going on inside. But this book, my first book, Where I've Come From, wasn't informed by that confessional poetic at all. This is much more a poetics of place and is much more informed by post-colonialism and by eco-poetics. And so this book was much more in relationship and in communication with the work of A.R.Ammons, who, as I've just said, is a poet that I will always treasure and always return to. It's a poet that I always learn from. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Dr. Phil Reads to Write. I hope you're enjoying the journey with me. I will continue to post a new episode each Friday morning, Australian Eastern Standard Time. So, catch you on another dragon soon. Bye for now.